The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Donald Trump returns to the stage. Can he? Will he resist running for president a third time? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production, as always, of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. We will consider the future plans of the 45th president this week, from the things he ruled out and refused to rule out in his post-presidential breakout appearance, and the question of the GOP and Trump, who needs whom more? LibertyNation.com's Jeff Charles was in the house for Trump's speech in the CPAC conference and will give us a perspective from ground level. Plus, Cuomo and Newsom, governors of the nation's two largest states, are feeling the heat turned up big time. We'll consider their prospects or lack thereof. Plus, Scott Cosenza, legal affairs editor for LibertyNation.com, joins us for Talkin' Liberty.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
We kick things off with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians in the chattering class. Not hard to pick this week's most ridiculous quote. Remember John Brennan, the CIA director under Barack Obama and the man at the center of the scandal which never got resolved during the Trump era, spying on the Trump campaign and then trying to cut the knees out from under Trump once he got into office? Well, this week, following claims by Trump followers about what caused the Capitol riot on January 6th that kicked in his Trump derangement syndrome afresh, Brennan condemned not just Trump or his followers, or most of the GOP, except for today's most prominent rhinos like Mitt Romney, Republicans in name only, but his own entire race and gender.
Well, I must say I'm increasingly embarrassed to be a white male these days, in light of what I see of my other white males saying. But it just shows that with very few exceptions, like Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, there are so few Republicans in Congress who value truth, honesty, and integrity. And so they'll continue to gaslight the country the way that Donald Trump did. It is just a disgusting display of craven politics that really should have no place in the United States in 2021.
So there you have it. John Brennan lecturing us on truth, honesty, and integrity. Talk about chutzpah. He's ashamed to be white, ashamed to be a man, and more than anxious and willing to carry on his deranged crusade, even with Trump resting at home in Florida instead of tormenting Brennan and his ilk from the White House. Maybe he's just got nothing better to do, doesn't know how to carry on, lost his way, with Trump no longer front and center to kick around. But thanks to the paranoia of Brennan and his fellow travelers on the left, the capital of the United States remains locked down like a cross between a war zone and a banana republic, even though, as the top Republican of the House Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, observed, this is not about security. It's pure theater designed to exaggerate the threat.
This is nothing compared to the threats that we've seen over the last 2 decades since 9/11, 2001, of radical Islamic potential attacks on the Capitol and the targeting of politicians and other government buildings. So what this is really about, this is a Hollywood production scene. So nobody's in Washington, D.C. You can't find anybody. Nobody's on the streets. The restaurants are mostly closed. So this is all about narrative building. What they want to do is they want to label every conservative and Republican across this country as some type of dangerous domestic terrorist threat. I think it's going to blow up in their face. It looks worse than a third world country.
So March 4th, the day where this supposed insurrection was supposed to occur, came and went, nothing happened, but still National Guard troops, fences, barbed wire, locking down what we used to call the People's House and several blocks around it. How long can they justify this wartime footing? Meanwhile, the walls continue to close in on the Democratic governors of the nation's 2 largest states. In California, Gavin Newsom faces a recall, with organizers claiming they've surpassed the 1.5 million signatures needed to put the recall on the ballot. And the heat really got turned up on the riches to rags governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, this week. Not only is he on the skillet for false reporting of nursing home deaths during the pandemic, but 3 women have now come forward claiming sexual harassment. And you know a guy's in trouble when members of his own party start calling for impeachment, as happened with Democratic State Senator Julio Salazar from Brooklyn.
I think he's just too compromised to continue in his position.
Is impeachment the best remedy?
I think that we have to use every remedy and every mechanism at our disposal. I think it's very clear to the public that he has deliberately abused his power, both his expanded executive powers in the state of emergency, but also his power over his employees.
Cuomo, of course, has denied any improper sexual conduct. But the ferocious New York State Attorney General Letitia James, also a Democrat, has launched an investigation. At this point, Governor Cuomo needs to outlive not 1 but 2 scandals, and probably ought to be asked that famous question from the Southwest Airlines ad, want to get away? And the fallout goes beyond the New York governor to his brother, the outspoken Chris Cuomo, on CNN, who famously joked around with his brother on air and propped him up when he was heralded as a star of the pandemic last summer. But now, with his brother edging closer and closer to impeachment or resignation, Chris is washing his hands.
Obviously, I'm aware of what's going on with my brother. And obviously, I cannot cover it because he is my brother. Now, of course, CNN has to cover it. They have covered it extensively, and they will continue to do so.
Objectively, I'm sure. Meanwhile, the man who tormented and was tormented by leftists like Cuomo in what he calls the fake news media made his much anticipated return to the national stage. Donald Trump appeared before a raucous crowd at the premier event of the conservative year, the CPAC conference, and squelched one rumor early in his speech.
I want you to know that I'm going to continue to fight right by your side. We're not starting new parties. You know, they kept saying, he's going to start a brand new party. We have the Republican Party. It's going to unite and be stronger than ever before. I am not starting a new party.
Okay, so he'll remain a Republican, easily the most influential one in the country. And as definitive as he was about not starting a new party was as tantalizing as he was about the prospects of running for president one more time.
With your help, we will take back the House. We will win the Senate. And then a Republican president will make a triumphant return to the White House. And I wonder who that will be. I wonder who that will be.
Will he or won't he run a third time? Perhaps only his hairdresser knows for sure. For you young folk, that's from a famous old commercial. And if he does run, could Trump win 4 more years in the White House? Well, when you consider the state of the country right now, and even after the events of January 6th, the answer is maybe. How bad are things? Well, psychologist and author of the book, The Parasitic Mind, How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense, Gad Saad, lists many reasons why society is descending into what he calls an abyss of ultimate lunacy.
1. It is now racist for a white person to translate the work of a black person. 2. It is now homophobic for a straight actor to play a gay character. 3. It is now racist for a white therapist to treat a black client. 4. It is now racist to have advanced high school programs. 5. It is now transphobic for biological females to reject having to compete against trans women, i.e. biological males.
Common sense, if there is any left, remains the only cure for what Mr. Gad Saad calls ultimate lunacy. We'll have more from the psychologist and author in the weeks ahead. Quick break, and then we're back to discuss what conservatives really want for 2022 and 24.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, you get tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis, Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles. And now, you can keep your kids ahead of the curve with LNGenZ.com. LN Gen Z brings a free-thinking education right into your home for students of every grade level with articles, videos, worksheets, and ready-to-go curriculum. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
His people waited for weeks for him to reemerge as a private citizen, breathless with anticipation about what he would say and do when he would eventually emerge from his relative post-presidential silence. And Donald Trump broke that silence in a big way at the premier event on the annual conservative calendar, the CPAC conference over last weekend in Orlando, Florida. Notable for what he ruled out and what he refused to rule out in the near future. LibertyNation.com's Jeff Charles was there and joins us now with reflections and maybe even some cool inside information from the CPAC conference. Welcome back, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I appreciate it. We might well have expected, or at least understood, if the mood among conservative activists was gloomy or forlorn after this last election when they won nothing. Was that the mood at this big event, or was it more upbeat than that?
Not even close. I mean, after the election, yes, there was some gloominess going on. Some people were very downtrodden. But at CPAC, it was totally different. Very upbeat, very optimistic. These people are ready to make some things happen and affect some positive change. And a lot of it is about Trump, the anticipation of his speech, but it was just a very positive mood overall about the agenda that they want to pursue. So all of that defeatism, it's gone now. It has no place here anymore. And I saw that at CPAC.
Well, that's really interesting. That's not the answer I might have expected. But one issue, probably the single issue that sits over the conservative movement, Republicans, GOP, is election integrity. Because so many conservatives, Republicans did not believe that the outcome that was reported in the last election was on the up and up. So how much discussion was there? How significant was talk about election integrity among these conservative activists?
Yeah, election integrity was a dominant theme throughout the whole event, even leading up to President Trump's speech. After his speech, I actually got to do some interviews with some people that were in attendance, and there were two main things that they brought up. One of them was election integrity, ensuring that future elections are on the up and up, as you said, and to make sure that to make sure that there isn't room for the amount of questionable activity that took place during this past election. Whether you believe that the election was stolen or not, everybody agrees that there were some serious issues in the way this election was conducted.
Now, what was the sense from the conservative activists at the CPAC conference about a couple of things? Whether Trump should run again, but also their sense of whether he will run one more time.
Yeah, so, I mean, there were people who were talking about whether he will run again. Mainly, it was just that anticipation, right? I mean, especially when he was going to speak on Sunday, they were like, is he going to announce a run? And Trump, I mean, he didn't really lay that out. He kind of teased it, but he didn't full out say he was running or not running. I think a lot of people would like it if he ran again, but I think even if he doesn't, what they want is somebody who will continue Trump's policies. And I think that was my main takeaway. Trump may run, he may not. He may get the nomination, he may not. But the bottom line is that the base wants his approach to governance.
And to that point, Jeff, the poll of people attending CPAC indicated 97% job approval for Trump, which is remarkable considering 4 years earlier, perhaps most of the attendees were not even convinced that Trump was a real conservative. Did you get a sense that people were surprised or perhaps even shocked by how faithful Trump was to the conservative agenda and beyond?
Yeah, that wasn't really discussed as much, but I think after the 4 years, they weren't quite as shocked. But I think they elected him because they knew that nobody in the GOP establishment was actually going to do what they said that they were going to do. The main difference between Trump and the establishment is that they both say they support certain policies, but Trump was one that actually pushed to get those policies enacted. And in some areas, right, he's not as conservative as people would like him to be, but in other areas he is. But the bottom line is when it comes to implementation, he is probably more conservative than a lot of his predecessors. I asked people what the most important part of President Trump's speech was. The first thing was election integrity, like I said, and the other was the establishment, getting rid of establishment figures in the GOP, the squishy Republicans who basically function as diet Democrats. I'll tell you right now, the base is done with establishment figures who get elected by making promises that they know they're not going to keep and then getting into Washington and saying, well, you got to vote for me because otherwise it'll be a Democrat. They're done with that. We're going into a new area where we actually expect results. That's the feel that I got from people at CPAC.
Well, maybe the progressives felt that way in 2016. Like, we're not going to settle for Hillary Clinton. We want a real progressive, or we're not going to get energized about this election. And of course, she lost. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Jeff
Charles, LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back to consider a paradox. How the man the GOP, or much of it, is blaming for November's defeat is the man they must now rely on more than ever.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, it's as paradoxical as it is real. The man widely blamed in establishment circles for losing an eminently winnable presidential election and control of the Senate to boot is the same man the party leadership must now depend on more than ever. If that wasn't clear before this past weekend. It certainly is now, following the raucous reception which greeted the rejuvenated 45th president at the premier event of the conservative year, the 2021 CPAC convention, which we discussed with Jeff Charles in the last segment. While questions had persisted since Election Day about whether grassroots activists would move on from Trump, the crowd treated Trump as a heroic figure who remains very much in their hearts and on their minds. Nevertheless, you've doubtless heard the grumbles from mainstream Republicans stunned by the election and its aftermath, who never understood or embraced the Trump movement to begin with, but of course were willing to bask in the power it conferred upon them. They are asking a contemporary iteration of an age-old rhetorical question, usually posed by those people more concerned with victory at any cost than effective policy. Here's the question. Would you rather compromise and win, or hold firm to your beliefs and lose? Would you prefer to cling to your guns and your religion and Trump, and kiss control of the White House and Congress goodbye for as far as the eye can see? That false choice is being implicitly offered to conservatives these days by GOP leaders desperately scrambling to define their party in the wake of an election which left them powerless. They believe Trump is now toxic to the party, and yet they realize the paradoxical and awful to them reality that he's crucial to victory in the upcoming midterm and presidential elections. If the 45th president had been reelected, he would have served out a second term and then moved on with his life, leaving in his wake a party fully committed to an unambiguous agenda, America First. After all, the MAGA platform would have been upvoted by the nation's voters twice. Instead, the GOP is left to engage in a perilous hangover that far exceeds the usual finger-pointing which follows defeat for the highest office in the land. The events of January 6th split the party root from branch, or you might say establishment from grassroots, confirming the worst fears of embedded party regulars, swamp dwellers, while doing little to separate Trump from his millions of passionate supporters. And this leaves the party, to put it mildly, in a lurch. While no one, perhaps even Trump, can be sure what grand plan that Donald has in the offing, what mountain he plans next to climb, we know he certainly won't sit still, and he won't remain silent. Some have offered the opinion that the 45th president might run again. Daughter-in-law Lara Trump implied as much recently, and of course, true to form, he left the possibility wide open at CPAC, stating in full Trumpian form, "Maybe I'll beat them a third time." But given his confrontational style and take no prisoners modus operandi, he might instead be perfectly suited to the role of kingmaker and breaker, throwing his support behind select policy initiatives and MAGA-friendly candidates, while encouraging primary challenges to squishy rhinos. Some believe he might complete his personal trifecta of conquest by adding a media empire to those he built in real estate and politics. But it's that final option which had scared the bejesus out of Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, Kevin McCarthy, and other high-ranking Republicans left to pick up the pieces after the party's downward spiral following the 2020 election. It's hardly a secret that McConnell, currently the nation's highest-ranking Republican, and who, like so many of his D.C.-based colleagues, never understood Trump or the MAGA movement, was so infuriated by losing the Senate and the Capitol riot that he has vowed not to speak to Trump again. But he's a savvy political warhorse. And so this Senate minority leader also knows that, like it or not, spurning the bombastic billionaire means waving your party's prospects goodbye for a good long time. McConnell understands that Donald Trump can easily and effectively hold the GOP hostage simply by threatening to separate his supporters from the party, either through his typically unfiltered, swamp-draining narratives or by that final nuclear option, which must not be named, a third party. There's little doubt that a party with a working title of the America First Party would siphon countless millions of voters away from the listless GOP. This would all but guarantee that no Republican would hold down the Oval Office for the foreseeable future. If 10 or 20 million votes move from the GOP to this new third party, highly conceivable in the case of Trump, any Democrat with a pulse would glide to a landslide victory. Trump, though, has always been about one thing above all others. Add up the wealth and fame and power he's amassed, and the sum is his one real passion, winning. He spoke of it constantly during his 5.5 years as candidate and president, and most famously promised in 2016 that he would win so often as president that the country would actually become sick of winning. He knows perfectly well that a third party will not win because of the impenetrable fortress of infrastructure built by the two major parties, leading to their long and exclusive hold on national power. That's why the former president effectively ruled out the notion of a new party at the CPAC conference in his most consequential speech since leaving office. While Trump could foreseeably run again and left open that possibility, considering January 6th and all the forces arrayed against him, he's unlikely to win. He could turn his attention to the media, providing himself a fresh megaphone to replace his disabled social media accounts. But that'll take a great deal of time to get that kind of enterprise up and running. Thus, the best guess here for a man who places victories, big and small, above all else, is that he'll be able to claim the most triumphs by wielding the outsized influence of his post-presidency bully pulpit on future policy debates and national political races. He can thus claim to have amassed yet more wins in influencing the course of history from both inside and outside the White House. If he does decide to settle for the role of kingmaker and breaker, Donald Trump would be foregoing the undeniable appeal to him and his supporters of holding the GOP's feet to the fire with a new conservative, populist, nationalist political party. But even he knows he has to bow to the bitter reality that such a move would lead to the virtually certain defeat of both parties, and in the process, severely weaken or even destroy the future of not just the GOP, but the America First movement itself. Indeed, based on his coming out at CPAC and the lingering questions it answered, and no matter how the former president decides to invest his future, the conclusion is unavoidable. The Republican Party needs Donald Trump a whole lot more than he needs them. Quick break, and then we're back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, you get tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis, Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles. And now, you can keep your kids ahead of the curve with LNGenZ.com. LN Gen Z brings a free-thinking education right into your home for students of every grade level with articles, videos, worksheets, and ready-to-go curriculum. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
And now we welcome you to the portion of Liberty Nation Radio, which we entitle Talkin' Liberty. It's when we reintroduce our regular contributor. You know him. He's the LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, constitutional lawyer, and the man we depend on as our guardian of individual liberty, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hi, Tim.
Well, now the ACLU, an organization that you have long believed in considerably more than I have, but you had You know, you had the belief that they really did fight for civil liberties broadly defined, but now it appears that the ACLU is abandoning individual justice in favor of race-based justice. What evidence do we have of that?
Well, before we talk about that, I would say it's not, I don't think you can say it's my belief, Tim. If you look at the breadth and depth of cases where individual liberty is upheld over state action, where ACLU attorneys and ACLU action was the genesis of it right through to the completion of it, any fair reading would say they are vital or have been vital. And that's actually the sadness of it all. It doesn't look like they're going to be vital anymore to the protection of liberty in our country.
Well, what have they done now to favor race-based justice as opposed to individual justice?
Well, they've had so we talked, I think, maybe earlier about the Smith College case and how they have favored basically a young woman came forward and said that she was a victim of racial discrimination without a single scintilla of evidence, except for that woman's testimony. And by testimony, I mean like tweets or Facebook posts. They condemned these people who did nothing wrong and were not racist and just really abandoned everything that they stood for with that action. Okay, so that you could say, well, is that a one-off? Is that a mistake? Well, we know it's not, because in the face of Virginia's marijuana legalization bill, they criticized the bill, Tim, not because it was insufficiently quick with removing the criminal restrictions that marijuana users or possessors might face, but because it didn't include a racial justice component. And what that would mean, Tim, is that black and brown people would get basically superior treatment with bidding for contracts for dispensaries and that sort of thing, and money directed towards causes that could be associated with them. That was the primary objection to the law, is that it didn't have this racial justice component. And I think it is exceedingly dangerous for all of us if it's sort of like if the NRA goes away, I mean, warts and all, it's been helpful for gun owners to have them as an ally by and large. And for all of us, it's by and large helpful to have the ACLU. And if there's a vacuum created because of this racial justice stuff, we're in for it.
Will they not say, though, that there should be that kind of race-based clause in there because blacks have been subject to imprisonment and conviction for marijuana offenses at a higher rate, a substantially higher rate than white people?
Well, sure, that's what they would say, but that has nothing to do with individual justice. That has to do with affirmative action programs, which right. It's one thing that they should say that it should be legal to engage in for private actors or other state actors, but to compel discrimination against whites, Asians, you name it, in the law, that is that's a marked change, Tim. And boy, it's a big one.
We have a couple of stories about civil asset forfeiture and seizure. And before you bring them to us, explain exactly what civil asset forfeiture is once again and why it's a threat to our liberty.
Okay, Tim, civil asset forfeiture is basically the notion and if people are listening think that doesn't make much sense. Well, it doesn't make much sense to me either. But here goes the explanation, is that property itself can be guilty. So if there is a person who is, for instance, alleged to have been a drug dealer, they may say they want to forfeit that drug dealer's car, right? You've seen the cigarette boats from back in the day, that kind of thing. Well, what they do is they don't sue the owner of the vehicle to say, we allege that you've been using this. They actually attach or sue the vehicle itself. And the reason why that's important is because it places a burden, it shifts the burden from the government from prosecuting you for a crime to you having to kind of prove in court that the article they want to seize was not used in the manner they say. It is almost impossible to do and costs a fortune if you can afford it in the first place, and most people can't. And that brings us to the first story here, Tim, which is this woman named Melinda Harris, and it's a perfect example of the case. Her son, Travis, was suspected of selling drugs. He wasn't convicted of it, and he wasn't convicted of using her vehicle to do so. But the police were able to seize the vehicle, and because she couldn't afford a lawyer to just kind of go in there and make hay for her. She waited until the Massachusetts authorities gave her the opportunity to present that proof. But here's the thing, Tim, they waited 5 years. That's right. They seized the vehicle and waited 5 years before they gave her the opportunity to prove it was hers. Now, she could have hired a lawyer to go sue them, but that would have cost probably more than the vehicle was worth. And she didn't do that. And the Institute of Justice has now taken her as a client, and they're trying to convince other courts that delay is in itself constitutionally impermissible.
Okay, Scott, so how does that relate to the Arizona case?
So in Arizona, it looks like, Tim, fingers crossed, the legislature and the governor are going to sign a bill that eliminates civil asset forfeiture without a criminal conviction. And that is what I think, if you want to be a steward of liberty and properly incentivize police, that's what we have to do in this country, because otherwise it just places all our property kind of at the whim of somebody who has a lot more money and power than we do. So if that's implemented, that'll be a great measure for the citizens.
So much has been written and said and shouted from the rooftops about the so-called insurrection on January 6th at the United States Capitol. The FBI has conducted, I guess, a thorough investigation and concluded that the scenario that most people sort of thought was true about it, which is, dozens of armed insurrectionists going into the Capitol, really isn't true at all.
That's exactly right. I think they recovered no guns from people they arrested, or 2 guns were in the possession of people, and in their possession meaning like holstered, secured, concealed. Nobody was waving guns. Nobody was shot. And the one person that, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the man's name, the Capitol officer they said was murdered by being bludgeoned by a fire extinguisher, that they're going back on that story. And I think it's really important, Tim, because they're using, and I'm using the grand they there, okay? Kind of uniparty, anti-liberty folks are using the notion that it wasn't an armed insurrection to dial back liberty presently, right down our nation's capital.
That's what they always do.
And they'll continue to do so and continually use this lie going forward. We can expect, I think, in the next 4 years, some really aggressive pushes on gun control from President Biden and Vice President Harris. And I expect we'll be hearing more about this lie.
And of course, they're using it as the justification for continuing to lock down the Capitol. And Scott, by the way, we're now past March 4th, and there was no takeover of the U.S. Capitol as was predicted back in January. Remember? Finally, Scott, FBI again. They have the phone data for members of Congress, for you, for me. Is it for everyone?
Well, they don't have them for you, Tim, because you weren't down at the scene of the events on the 6th of January. They do have mine, though, because I was there reporting for LibertyNation.com, and they do have all the Congress people who were there at the time. Congressman Paul and some others have been questioning them about how they're going about getting this data and what they plan to do with it. And we know that the FBI has been thoroughly corrupted. That's been revealed, in abundance over the past few years. So what will they do with that data? So, for instance, they have, I was there and reporting as a First Amendment protected activity for LibertyNation.com. What will they do with my data? If I spoke to a source about what might have happened at the Capitol, how's that going to be used? That should be protected. But we're not getting answers from the FBI on this.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
Scott Cosenza, legal affairs editor at LibertyNation.com. This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, all available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we will be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.